going to take on one of the biggest issues in a long time, the passage of the budget reconciliation bill, which is broad in scope and has many dire impacts on our Commonwealth and on many, many people, really across the globe, as we'll get to. What we're going to do tonight is James Walkinshaw, I think, who needs no introduction, our candidate for Congress, is going to give a few opening remarks. Then Senator Salim will give a few remarks. Then I'm going to do some briefing. And then we're very fortunate to have Delegate Vivian Watts, chair of our Finance Committee in the Commonwealth House of Delegates. And she's going to talk about the tax provisions. And then I'll finish up with some more stuff. We will, if you have questions, you can put them on the chat. We have a pretty nice audience here, which is great. But I'm not sure we'll be able to get to every question, but we'll try. All right. Without further ado, I'll kick it over to James and give us your thoughts on this situation.
Well, thank you, Andy, and it's so great to see such a big crowd here, and thank you for organizing this entire series of briefings. I think it's a great service to us, and I spent a big chunk of the primary campaign that we just went through talking about what Trump calls the big beautiful bill. I call it the big BS bill, in the hopes of generating enough opposition to it to stop it. Quite frankly, I was never optimistic that we would be able to block this bill's passage in Congress. I spent more than a decade watching Republicans in Congress, and if there's one thing that motivates them above all else, it is cutting taxes for the very wealthy and taking health care from working people. And fundamentally, that's what this bill does and it is about. So unfortunately, I think it was always the case that they were going to pass this bill. I wish they hadn't, but at the same time, it does give us as Democrats an opportunity to communicate to the American people exactly what Trump and this Republican majority in Congress are all about. And I won't go too far into the details of the reconciliation bill because I know Andy's going to give you and the other folks here are going to give you a lengthy presentation on it. I will just hit some of the highlights, things that you have probably heard before. But because of this bill, somewhere between 16 and 17 million people will lose their health insurance through the cuts to Medicaid, the cuts to Affordable Care Act programs. And fundamentally, this bill is about making life more difficult for working people who are trying to access health care. It increases red tape and arbitrary requirements and bureaucracy to make their lives so difficult and make it so cumbersome that they can't qualify for the programs that they deserve to access and that we as taxpayers all pay for. We know, and and you have read, that millions of families will lose access to food assistance as a result of this bill. The CBO has confirmed that SNAP benefits will be stripped from millions of families. And why are they doing all of this? Fundamentally, it's to give more tax breaks to the wealthy. There's a total of $5 trillion in tax breaks in the bill. Most of that money goes to the very wealthy. In fact, the richest 0.1%, the richest 0.1% will receive an average $300,000 tax cut in 2027 as a result of this bill. So that's what this is really all about. It's also, and I know Andy will talk about this, it is a complete fiscal disaster. If anyone ever believed that the Republican Party was a party of fiscal responsibility, this bill should explode that myth the way that it explodes the deficit and the debt, adding at least $3 trillion to the national debt. And I know this will be talked about later. That's not just an abstract thing. We're at a point now with the deficit and debt where it is a driver of inflation and will be a driver of inflation moving forward. That means higher costs for Americans who try to purchase a home, higher costs for Americans who go to the grocery store to buy their groceries, and on and on and on. An issue that's a personal passion of mine, clean energy and climate change and environmental issues. The bill, as we know, phases out key tax incentives, which will discourage the transition to electric vehicles, solar, wind. It abandons so much of the progress on climate and innovation that the Biden administration led on. But I think an important point for us to take to our neighbors across Fairfax and to the American people across the nation, this bill will drive up energy costs by making those renewable energy projects more expensive. It significantly boosts funding for ICE, for immigration enforcement, uh, exacerbating the reckless
Come
approach
on.
that ICE is taking
Okay,
across
I'm
our
in.
communities,
It's just I'm trying to get the sound.
taking their eye off the ball of dealing with the small number of folks
Here.
who are committing violent acts and terrorizing and deporting law-abiding, tax-paying immigrants in our community. And look, I think if Congress wanted to invest in public safety, actually making communities across the country safer, we know that investing in local police departments that do community policing makes communities safer. We know that investing in violence intervention programs that can reduce homicide rates makes communities safer. They could have done those things. More money for ICE to continue their terror campaign does not make our communities safer. So we know that there will be significant consequences to this bill. Rural hospitals will close. People will lose access to their health care. People will lose access to critical nutrition assistance. Experts from Yale and UPenn have said that this bill could result in as many as 51,000 premature, unnecessary deaths per year. When people lose access to their health care, they die. This is a life and death issue for many, many Americans. It is not abstract. So it is incumbent on us as Democrats, and I intend to do this over the course of this campaign and hopefully after the campaign in Congress, to go to the American people and explain just how much of a betrayal this bill is. Donald Trump ran for office, ran for president, saying that he was going to help Americans and lower costs for Americans. This bill will make their lives more expensive. There is no question about that. For the vast majority of Americans, their lives will be more expensive as a result of this bill. And we have to take that to the American people. Final point I'll make, it is really important for us to communicate the facts to people because Republicans are lying about this bill already. My Republican opponent in this race said to WTOP just this week that the bill doesn't, and this is a quote, doesn't cut a dime from Medicaid. And that is just flat out untrue. It is just untrue. But they are already starting that narrative. So we really have to get out there and tell people the facts. And I think we have a real opportunity to highlight the contrast between our values as Democrats. We're focused on making people's lives more affordable, lowering healthcare costs, making it easier to purchase a home, making it easier to put your kids in college. And this big BS bill from the Republicans is going to make all of that harder for hardworking families across this country. So, Andy, thank you. Delegate Watts, Senator Salim, thank you for being here to help us spread that message and educate ourselves. And thank you all so much for giving up your evening to be part of it.
Thank you so much, James. We look forward to hearing a lot more from you in years to come. And thank you for your time. Next, Senator Salim. Go ahead, Sanam. Hold on. Technical problem.
Andy, can you make me host?
Okay. I've made you host. Sorry, everyone.
There we go. That works. The host had to unmute me. Thank you, Supervisor Walkinshaw, and thank you, Delegate Watt, for being here. And Andy, thank you for putting this together. I think it's a good segue for us. Some of the things that I want to talk about. I'm Senator Saddam Salim. I represent Senate District 37. And in my term for 4-year term, in it for 2 years. And as somebody who's worked in the federal side and as a contractor I've done budgets for about almost 5 years in a couple of agencies, and now I get the opportunity to be in the state house and to represent folks um, that are actually federal contractors that are impacted by this, including a lot of my constituents. So I really wanted to just quickly talk about. It is true what James has said. This is not a beautiful bill at all. This is actually a bill that's going to cripple a lot of us, especially in Virginia. So I really want to go into what that means. It's going to go and put a lot of cuts to Medicaid. This isn't just, some abstract line item in a budget. This is about real people. This is about elderly parents, our children with disabilities, and low-income families who rely on Medicaid for life-saving care. We're looking at potentially 21% reduction in federal Medicaid funding for our state, which ends up meaning that there's going to be loss of healthcare coverage. More rural hospitals are going to struggle to keep their doors open. And that ripple effect is going to end up where we all end up paying more for our healthcare costs. This includes, a lot of hospitals, especially the hospitals that are community oriented. They've been, looking at this bill as a way to say, this is going to cripple us. This is going to take away our ability to provide services. And that's exactly what this is going to do. They're going to have to find the money somewhere else. If not, they're going to end up closing those down. And in Virginia, this is particularly going to impact Southwest Virginia, where a lot of people rely on community hospitals or hospitals that are funded by Medicaid. And the second part about this is, and many of you may have already seen this, is that literally this is taking food off of our families. Folks that rely on SNAP, those are the folks that are going to get impacted by this. Over 100,000 people that are low-income Virginians. And I say this as somebody who has come from low-income housing, who's come from government-assisted programs. This is not just about, hey, it's a couple 100,000 people. This is about real people that are going to go hungry, despite their parents working, and of course the new requirements that they're putting out there, so that people who want to get the government assistance have to do a lot more in order to get those benefits. And it's going to end up where people are going to pick: do I feed my family, or do I go ahead and pay the rent, or do I just abandon the whole idea of feeding my family? And in Virginia, before my time, before I got to the General Assembly, we passed the Clean Economy Act. And that focused a lot on some of the environmental impacts. What are we going to do to eliminate the harm that is being done in the Commonwealth? And this bill, what it does is it slams that brake on our clean energy progress. It eliminates vital tax credits for electric vehicles and home energy upgrades, essentially just gutting every program that's designed to protect the environment. And we in Virginia have done the work over the last couple of years in making sure that we set the standards of what does it mean to do better for the environment. So when I talk about a couple of these things, I don't just say it because that's what's written out there or that's what we see on the news. These are real things that are impacting Virginia. And my ask to a lot of you all is that, what can Virginia do? What can we as legislators do? And those things are going to end up being where we have to prioritize and protect some of the projects that are in our Commonwealth. We have to make sure we find funding for the difference in funding, whether it's Medicaid or SNAP benefits. We as a state have to find that difference. And the other part is we as a state have to ensure that we continue to build on the progress we have made when it comes to the environment, when it comes to the future of Virginia and what they're doing for the environment. So those are some of the things. And the one thing I will ask a lot of the folks that are here is that Andy's going to go through a lot of data. He's going to go through a lot of information that at first might not really make sense. But you have to understand is that a lot of the provisions on the bill is not going to get, it's not going to be put in place immediately. It's going to take a couple of years. One of the things is that some of the Medicaid and some of the Social Security benefits that are getting impacted, they're not going to you're not going to see a lot of that until 2026 or halfway through 2026. In reality, a lot of these are going to impact folks who have to plan financially for the future. So I just want to come on here and thank each and every one of you for being here. I know Andy does a great job. He's led, different places where he's led the budget team and he teaches a course. And over the years, when I have gotten to know him, he's been a straight shooter. So I hope you all will enjoy this. And I know Delegate Watts, who's really the Dean of Northern Virginia delegation, and really has been somebody who I admire since I got to the General Assembly. So I'm glad she's speaking at this as well. So thank you. Somebody has to unmute Andy.
Sorry, I had a dog barking. And can you see it? Can everyone see the slides? Okay, the first thing I want to do is let you know that these slides have been developed mostly by me. Delegate Watts developed the slides on the taxes, but these are my responsibility. So it's not a party slide. It's not any elected official slides. If there's something wrong, the accountability comes back to me. So just wanted to start that off. And here's our agenda tonight. We're going to cover set the context with President Trump's record of fiscal irresponsibility and slow economic growth from his first term. Then we got to set the conditions, to set the scene, if you will, by overviewing our broken budget process very quickly. Then we'll talk about the fiscal impact of the Republican budget. Spoiler alert, it's a huge increase to the deficit. Then we're going to go through systematically taxes. Delegate Watts will lead us on taxes. We're very fortunate to have her. Then we're going to talk about healthcare, education, the safety net, national security, and we'll conclude with kind of a summary of the major impacts on Virginia. So let's talk about President Trump's first term. And just this chart just shows that under Trump, the deficit increased by almost 50%, about 40%. So Trump has a track record of fiscal irresponsibility. Now, we can't really blame him for this huge deficit because that was COVID. But before COVID, he had already increased the deficit mostly through his Tax Cut Act of 2017, which was not paid for. Then let's look at the growth. The big claim is that we had the greatest economy ever and we were growing a lot and everything was great. Well, what the data actually shows is the economy was slowing even before COVID hit. That the Trump plan of rapidly increasing growth basically failed. It was declining in the third year of his president. And let's just take the step back and look at the macro level at the last 5 presidents' record on economic growth. And Donald Trump is the worst president for economic growth of any of our last 5 presidents. Trump's policies do not generate economic growth. And we'll see why as we talk through this presentation. Now, let's talk about the budget process because we need to understand where we are before we really talk this through. And we also need to talk about not just the big ugly bill, that terrible reconciliation law. We also need to talk about what he's doing with a discretionary funding. So basically, you need to understand that in the federal government, there's 2 kinds of budgets. There's the discretionary budget, which goes through the normal process of appropriations law, and that's for the things that we normally think of government, defense, most of the administration, national parks, and stuff like that. But that's only 25% of the budget, roughly, if you look at this pie chart. What most government spending is about 3/4 of it is what we refer to as mandatory spending. And this is done, funding made by permanent laws. It's not done every year. And this kind of funding, they don't set the amount of funding for the program. They set the conditions that you get. If you meet these conditions, you get the money. In Social Security, if you meet the age requirements, you get the funds. If you're a federal retiree, you meet the requirements, you get the funds. And so the biggest part of our federal spending is Social Security, then Medicare, then Medicaid, then other mandatory, which is things like retirement programs, and then the interest on the debt. So just keep that in mind as we go forward. Now, this is kind of an ugly chart, but let me walk you through it. So the budget process that we use was established basically by the 1974 Budget Act, but it's been amended. And what they tried to do with this act is create a process that would control both discretionary spending and mandatory spending. So the way this process is supposed to work is the president submits a budget to Congress, the president's budget request. CBO, the Congressional Budget Office, reviews the president's budget. Then the budget committees are supposed to report out what's called a budget resolution. Now, it's a resolution because it's not a law. It's passed by both branches of Congress, but the president does not sign it. What it does is essentially change the rules or establish the rules of both the House and the Senate. Now, this budget resolution, which was passed, the House passed one, then the Senate passed one a few months ago. You may have heard in the news. What it does is it does two separate things. First of all, on the discretionary side, it sets limits of spending for the committees. There's 12 appropriations committees, and through what's called 301A and 302 process, it sets the limits of spending for the appropriations committees. But what we've been talking about tonight is what's called the reconciliation bill. So what they did when they created this act is they said the House and Senate budget committees, through the resolution, would send instructions to the authorizing committees telling them to adjust the laws under their purview to achieve certain budget targets, to achieve the specified budget targets. And so that's what happened a few months ago. They passed a budget resolution that directed the committees to come up with bills that were then sent back to the budget committees, and they consolidated, and that's what we saw passed in the Senate recently. So this is a law passed. Now, why is it so important? The law specifies that a reconciliation bill cannot be filibustered. So that's why the Republicans were able to pass this without any Democratic votes. So we need to think both about the discretionary spending passed through the appropriation process and the changes to mandatory spending and taxes that was done through the reconciliation bill. Okay. I want to point out that before we begin this discussion, we do have a deficit problem in this country. This is the CBO, the Congressional Budget Office, every January does a projection of the budget deficits for the next 10 years. And this is what they said in January 17th, right before President Trump took office. They pointed out that we will have serious budget deficits, for the foreseeable future. And these are having impacts in terms of higher interest rates and jitteriness in the financial markets. So let's just keep that in mind. Well, where are we in the process? So on the mandatory side, we just passed the Big Ugly Act. Technically, is an act to provide for reconciliation pursuant to Title II of House Congressional Resolution 14, which is the budget resolution. So they actually, in the House, they called it the Big Beautiful Bill, but the Senate actually stripped that language out. So I don't know, maybe they were kind of realized something there. On the discretionary side, which is ongoing, the president released a budget document on May 2nd. It's not the traditional budget document. It does not meet the requirements of the law. The law specifies that the budget document should have a whole bunch of information, and President Trump violated the law by failing to provide the information. So a lot of the tables and charts and stuff I use are old because President Trump's team did not deliver the information that we really need to analyze the budget. Then traditionally CBO scores the budget. And then what's going on now is appropriations committees are drafting the bills. And so far, only one bill has passed, the Veterans Affairs Military Construction. 4 bills have passed through the House Appropriations Committee. And the thing we're seeing is these bills are following the president's request very closely. And that's going to impact because these cuts also are very devastating. The Senate has not moved on any appropriations bills yet. Remember, appropriation bills are subject to the filibuster, and that's going to present the Democrats in Congress, especially the Senate, with a very important decision. Do they filibuster these awful appropriation bills? And that's a challenge there because shutting down the government is a very serious thing, but letting these awful appropriation bills get passed would also be serious. So there is a real possibility for a government shutdown in October. And if the Democrats try to filibuster the appropriation bills, we can expect the Republicans to try to find ways around the filibuster or even get rid of it because they want the government to go forward. So it will be a tense time this fall. The budget drama is not over. So let's talk about the fiscal impact. The reconciliation law passed just now. This is CBO's estimate on what it's going to do to the budget deficit. Note that it is about a $480 billion increase in the deficit for fiscal 26. There's a $588 billion increase in the deficit to 2027. And then it goes down. And the reason it goes down in the out years is because a lot of the tax provisions expire, especially the provisions that are, and I think Delegate Watts will talk a little more about this, but they expire, the ones like no tax on tips and the stuff like that, the middle class tax provisions expire in 2029 and earlier. So you have this huge increase to the deficit. Now, here's how the Republicans are saying, and what we've gotten from news reports. This is what the president told, and the president's team told Republicans who were concerned about the deficit. They said, "Oh, it's not so bad. Yeah, we're going to increase the deficit a little bit because you can take the baseline, you add to the deficit the 479 and I'm talking about fiscal year 26, but then some countervailing things are going to help us out in the Republican view." The Republicans' plan is to cut $206 billion below the baseline in discretionary spending. That's what the president's budget request is doing. And they're saying, hey, we're going to do this, and we're going to cut these big, giant cuts out of social programs, which compound the damage to Medicaid that's being done to Medicaid and SNAP by the reconciliation bill. And then they also say that we're going to generate more revenue from tariffs. Currently, tariffs are generating about $20 billion a month. A rough swag would then be they would generate $240 billion. But prior to Trump, tariffs were generating $80 billion. So the net is an increase of is $160 billion. So what this shows is even after the president's mitigation factors of cutting discretionary funding and the tariffs, the deficit will still go up by about $100 billion. And that's assuming the tariff revenue stays, and that's very problematic. Okay, one of the things you hear from Republicans is that we're going to grow our way out, that this bill is going to unleash economic growth, and the growth is going to provide so much more revenue and taxes that's going to lower the budget. And they attack CBO because they say, oh, CBO doesn't do dynamic scoring. And dynamic scoring is when you take into the account in your estimates the growth, the macroeconomic impact of growth. Well, they're not really telling the truth, which shouldn't surprise you, because the Joint Committee on Taxation, which actually does the scoring for taxes, not CBO, actually did a dynamic score. They did the analysis. And what their analysis showed is a 0.3% increase in economic growth. What they said is over the 10-year span, you would get $100 billion, or about $8 billion per year. Now that's $8 billion on a $2.7 trillion economy. So it's essentially a statistical, nothingness. So the economic analysis shows that this bill will not drive economic growth. So what's the impact of this bill? It will require borrowing $3.3 trillion. But then it also increases the amount of borrowing, means you have to pay more interest. And the estimates are that's a $600 billion added charge. So the real impact on the deficit is close to $3.9 trillion, which is a lot of money. And this is over 10 years. But what this is going to do to the capital markets is it's going to drive up interest rates. And there's already economic research saying that that's starting to happen. What's called the full employment economic interest rate is now getting higher. It's inching up. Now, President Trump has an answer for this, right? He's telling the Federal Reserve, he's going to fire the Chairman Powell and put in his lackey, and they're going to keep interest rates low. But we know what happens when you try to artificially keep interest low through monetary policy. You get inflation. So when we jack up the deficit by this much and the nation's debt, we put us in a very difficult policy dilemma where you can take higher interest rates or inflation. It's not a good choice, and we need to figure out how to avoid that choice by having fiscally responsible leadership, which we're not getting out of President Trump. So I want to spend a couple minutes real quick looking at the president's FY 2026 discretionary budget request. And this is a copy. I didn't type this out. This is a copy from the president's budget request. And basically what it shows is a cut in $140 billion if we round up here. But the baseline, and they complain, the baseline growth was actually a little higher than that. So the cut against the baseline is about $206 billion, as I said earlier. So you go to the next slide, and I know this is small and you may not be able to see it, but what this page from their budget request shows that there's massive cuts to social services, science, and government operations. Education is a 15% cut. Health and Human Services, 26%. Housing and Urban Development, 43%. The Department of the Interior, 30%. Justice, 7%. Labor, 34%. State and international programs, and we'll talk about this later, 83%. 54% cut to EPA. And NASA, I don't know why they hate NASA. NASA gets a 24% cut. SBA, National Science Foundation, 55% cut. So when we think about the Republican budget plan, we have to understand that it's more than just the big ugly bill. It's what they're going to do in discretionary budgeting, which is bad. Okay, now I'm going to turn it over to Delegate Watts, and she's going to talk us through some of the tax provisions.
I'm unmuted.
Yeah, we can hear you. Thank you.
Okay, fantastic. Very impressive, Andy. Very impressive. So let me start in with the view from the tax side. And why a separate look at taxes? Well, actually, 2/3 of this bill is all about taxes. 2/3 of it. And yet, what I've highlighted here on this particular slide is my addition in yellow. As of July 1, 2/3 of Americans, when they were polled in several different polls, have heard little or nothing about the bill. Now, when under Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act, there was a year's process with a lot of public input, a lot of hearings throughout the country, but this was rushed through, as I will mention on a couple of other slides, so that we are in a situation where the bill is really whatever Trump decides to say it is, or whatever Republican decides to say it is, because what we're also finding is that even now, the Democrats are having the town halls as they go back to the districts, and this was one of the reasons for that July 4th deadline, was that there wouldn't be time for people to go back to their districts during the July 4th recess and really hear from people as to their concerns about what was being proposed. Instead, it went forward with little or no information. Again, 2/3 of the Americans don't know really what's in it. Andy, next one.
Sorry.
Okay, not a problem. So what you may have heard of on the tax side is a deduction for seniors. And by the way, one day before it was voted on, I'm listening to a U.S. senator being interviewed on PBS NewsHour who looked at the camera and was so generous about how Trump had spent so much time talking to him. 2 hours he was talking to me, and his cut to Social Security is they didn't cut Social Security. They gave a limited senior deduction of $6,000. It will expire at the end of Trump's term. At least half of the seniors have too little income to even benefit, as opposed to not taxing Social Security, which, by the way, Virginia and many states do not tax Social Security. But for those who do get some benefit, the most that they will get is $720. 6,000 saying your deduction sounds great until you put it through the whole tax form, and what you end up with in your pocket is $720. The no tax on overtime, which is going to cost $90 billion in the 4 years that it's active, phases out at $300,000. The average break is going to be $1,800, but most of the low income will get about $10. No tax on tips, which also only is for the 4 years of Trump's administration. Most don't declare cash on tips. I spent 7 years working my way through college as a waitress. I can assure you, and I've checked it with several restaurants recently in all levels of restaurants, most don't declare cash tips. Therefore, they're already tax-free. So only about 60% of those who get tips will get any break. The average is about $1,800, but it phases out as you go on up. The other one that is only in there for 4 years is no tax on car loan interest. That is for American-made only cars. And then finally, the fifth one that phases out at 4 years is the $1,000 to start an investment account for children under 8. I will talk more about that later. Next slide. This is a chart that came from the Committee for Responsible Federal Budgeting, one that is absolutely, their focus is on the deficit is too high. So it certainly has that credibility as opposed to, oh, don't pay any attention to that man behind the curtain. Notice here that the 5 tax breaks that I've just talked about for lower income, as opposed to the 6th one, all are going to phase out. If you were to keep them in effect, if permanent, that is where you're hearing that the actual deficit will be $4 trillion, not the 3.2. Notice also that I've highlighted that after the midterms, the beginning of 2027 is when the cuts to SNAP and Medicaid eligibility will be effective. So again, getting through the midterms, oh, look what we gave you in these tax cuts. Look, oh no, those Democrats are exaggerating about losses to Medicaid, are all being played like a violin, quite frankly, to again continue to hide the impact of what has been passed. The next slide. So the changes that are going to cost consumers that I would highlight is in repealing the green energy taxes, the credit for buying an EV ends at the end of this September. So if you're about to do it, end of September. The credit for home energy efficiency improvements ends at the end of December. These will raise electric bills, given that it's going to end all of IRA, solar, wind, battery, investment tax credits from the Infrastructure Act, if not actually in service within the next 18 months. And that means that you have to be in service You have to have all of your financing. You have already contracted for construction. You have all of the connections and you have to be in service, virtually impossible to achieve. And the concern is that in this last year, 24, renewables provided 19% of new energy capacity. And if we don't have that new energy capacity coming online, and solar comes online faster than any other of the sources of energy, the typical petroleum-based energy generation is usually 4, 5, 6 years before it comes online, will be lost because of the significant cut to the financing by Xing out the investment tax credits that this bill does. In addition to that, for Virginia in particular, the jobs generated by this type of renewable energy generation are good jobs, particularly the potential for having battery production within Southwest, and those good paying jobs for Southwest Virginia are gone. As has already been referred to by Andy, the higher interest rates are going to happen on all borrowing, because with the degree, and that's construction, that's mortgage payments, that's credit cards, they'll be driven up by the higher interest rates that's going to be needed to sell a significantly greater number of U.S. bonds. In recognition of this, finally, all three bond rating agencies joined when Moody finally joined, and America has been downgraded from being AAA rated to AA1. First time ever that we have been downgraded. The next one is the rich get richer. And so when you hear this about where all of this is going, let me just walk you through what generates the bottom lines of this is all going to the rich. So first of all, the bill extends the Tax Cuts and Job Act of 2017, the first Trump administration, which I from hereafter are going to call TCJA. It costs $4 trillion plus over a decade. And that's why back in 2017, under the congressional rules that are actually still in place, but have not been followed this time around, TCJA had to expire, not in 10 years, but in just 8 years, 2025, because otherwise it would have increased the federal deficit too much under the rules. This time, the Senate overrode the rules and forced CBO to treat TCJA as just being ongoing. We're not reenacting them at all. Oh, we've always considered the cost, which we have not as part of the deficit, but CBO was directed to zero out the cost of extending TCJA as having no cost. Therefore, half the benefits of extending TCJA go to the top 5%. That was baked in. Now, the Democrats in committee had offered to the R's to, keep all the cuts for 95% of taxpayers with incomes under $400,000. That's all the middle class, all the lower class, all the standard deduction, everything. We'll keep them, but please raise the top bracket back up to the pre-2017 rate of 39.6% instead of the TCJA of 37%. And Republicans wouldn't even accept that modest change, not only in the case of, for the sake of fairness, but for reducing the extreme cost of extending the TCJA. So the ballpark estimates of all of this are that, and this is the easiest one that I have to remember, the bottom fifth get $160, the top 1.1% get $269,160 annual tax break. I want to highlight that because you will hear, as it just came out in today's press from Youngkin, oh, the average. Youngkin I think typically of many who are trying to sell this package, always talk about averages. My mantra has always been a man drowned in a stream whose average depth was 4 feet. It is the range. It is the high IN that is drawing up the averages, but the lower income will never see the benefit. They get $160. The poorest 20% earning less than $31,000 will get an average tax cut of just $100. The middle 20%, encompassing more of middle class, will get almost $2,000. But again, it is the richest 1% with incomes over $843,000 who will get an average of $78,000. And again, that's an average. Many will get much higher than that. While the effective I want to note that while the effective tax rates have barely changed from 1945 to just before TCJA for most Americans, the rates for the high income have fallen sharply. So that's why you hear again and again and again, this is all about shifting wealth to the wealthiest rather than helping the kitchen table folks who are trying there desperately to meet their basic needs. The next, why do the rich get richer, as the next one? They do it through a number of ways. I'm just highlighting a few. There's all kinds of corporate and business loopholes. I've noted a few of them here: executive compensation, deductions of business income and dividends, no tax on interest on business loans. And then there's the capital gains tax of 21%. That is less than the rates on basic income that we as Fairfax County residents pay. By well over half of us pay more than that rate. That is the capital gains account for the big investors. The TCJA put the 21% rate also on investment managers' income, not just, again, any wealth gain on the market. And then there's the estate tax. With this bill, it now only applies to wealth over 30 million. Over 30 million. So all of this scare tactic that when you die, regular folks die, somehow that'll be taxed. No, quite frankly, we've paid our taxes during our lifetime. Those with this kind of wealth of 30 million plus, they have never paid capital gains on those investments, and they pass to the next generation without taxation. I'm going to be drawing down a lot of money out of my IRA accounts to keep us going and replace the car. I will pay capital gains tax on that. The wealthiest do not pay capital gains tax. It just passes on to the next generation. So it's not double taxation. It is a major tax loophole where they don't pay any tax. So that TCJA's simplification in 2017 led to 90% of the taxpayers now taking a standard deduction, because it's now up to almost $30,000. You don't have a lot of itemized deductions. We're done away with. There's no way that you have that much. So 90% of us aren't looking at all of these ways in which the very wealthy are able to reduce their wealth and have the means to maximize their use of those loopholes. Final comment on this slide. Therefore, all of the Republican reaction to gut IRS audits by refusing to increase funding for the IRS, and in fact, cutting the proposal that I've seen is to cut staffing by 50%, diverting some of it to border security. And it's the audits of the kind of loopholes I was talking about and how you apply them produces, in fact, a $12 return on every dollar spent. That money has just been wiped off the table, giving the very wealthy carte blanche to manipulate the tax code. Next chart, next slide. And this is just a quick example. I'm quoting Warren Buffett statement, outrageous that my secretary pays 2 times my tax rate And as you see here, for the very wealthiest, this is their effective tax rate, 1%, 3%, nothing like the normal taxpayers are paying. Next slide. So just let me go through just a couple other major tax changes among more than 50 others. The child tax credit, it increased to $2,200 up from current $2,000 enacted in 2017. It will also have an inflation factor that it hasn't had for the last 8 years. However, there are over 384,000 Virginia children in households that can't get the full tax refund due, as well as the fact that the child tax credit, there's none for 87,000 Virginia children because one parent is an illegal immigrant without a social security number. Again, another provision in this bill. I'm also noting these as tax credits that are going to not benefit the lower income. A new tax credit for contributing to nonprofits that fund scholarships for private K through 12 schools. That money, public money, gets diverted to private schools. The next one, the $1,000 account for quote unquote all children. I quote all, quote unquote, all children because it has to be invested in the stock market. And this really, we're only talking about the upper end of taxpayers who have the sophistication and the money to add to this account by investing in the stock market. Also, I'm sure you've heard some of the debate about the SALT cap. That's the state and local tax itemization. It's been raised to $40,000 for the next 5 years. It does have a $500,000 income cap. But what you're going to see, though, is that you have I've lost some of over 90% of the benefit are actually going to be going to people making over 200,000, and half of that is going to go to those making over 400,000. So again, major tax changes. You can see these, and this is not skewing it right here. 3 out of 4 all go to the upper end, making that balance that much more skewed towards the rich get richer. The next slide. So my last slide is revenue impacts on Virginia. I saw early on in the chat, do we have the resources in Virginia to deal with all the cuts that were being outlined? Well, let me start first with the factoid on Virginia taxes. We conform with federal taxes, note, except when we don't. So as I noted, we don't tax Social Security. We keep a personal exemption, which this bill zeroes out for the federal government. We also, unfortunately, no, this is not an unfortunately, we also said, no. We're not going to let the wealthy have unlimited deductions. We're going to keep the cap that had existed before 2017. And then we've also not conformed on selected business provisions because of the inequity of the way in which they play out. The other, of course, we're all aware the huge difference between Virginia and the federal government is we've got to balance the state budget. We don't go into deficit to fund the ongoing expenses. And so we're going to have to balance this while dealing with the Medicaid cuts that have already been noted. I want to say just a word or two about those Medicaid cuts. Our annual general fund budget is $30 billion a year. Over 10 years, the current projections are we're going to lose $33 billion in Medicaid alone, as much as our total budget in a year for all of the needs that the state must meet. We also are going to be severely hit by the removal of the provider tax that is charged to hospitals to pay for the matching cost of extending Medicaid. This has allowed rural hospitals to stay open. It has allowed us to not have this charged off to higher insurance rates when people come in the emergency room and don't have any insurance care. The hospital has to make up the difference, and typically that goes on other person's hospital bills and increased insurance rates. We're also going to have to work extremely hard to make sure that people are eligible under the new rules at least twice as hard, just because it has to be done every 6 months. But in reality, we are right now being pegged by saying you have an over 11% error rate. We don't know where those figures are coming from. We've got a hard year with a lot of funding that has to go with it to try to get all of these eligibility mechanisms accurately reaching out to people, fully reaching out to people, and having the kind of records that we can go back to the federal government and try to keep that $33 billion projected loss right now down to just 25 billion over the next decade. SNAP cuts, the thing that is most concerning to me about that is not just the loss of nutritional food to people who desperately need it, but the bill also removes the automatic eligibility for anyone who receives SNAP benefits to also get free and reduced school lunches and breakfast. The education cuts, K through 12, we've already seen an impoundment just last week of approximately $50 million that was impounded of money that had been approved by Congress for intellectually disabled and developmentally disabled, at risk, the poorest students and English language learners. We've already seen that impoundment for this year's cost, and some of these, which will mean at least $5 million, $6 million cut to Fairfax County, as we have to take these programs which are desperately needed, and particularly in a district such as I represent, which is centered around Annandale inside the Beltway. The average school system in Virginia receives 13% of its funding from the federal government. Some of them receive as much as 25%. The cuts to these localities are going to be that much more severe. That will also be pressure on the state budget. All the while, we're dealing with the current problems under critical ongoing of funding K through 12 adequately, as accurately highlighted by the JLARC study just about 2 years ago. We have an ongoing problem of affordable housing, serious needs for staffing in mental health, which, as in many areas, are exacerbated by having skilled work shortages, not only in what we have to pay for state employees to attract the skill that we need, but also what we've got to put into work training programs and fund them under higher ed. Higher ed has taken a big hit, particularly for the cost to families because of the cuts to student aid that is in this bill that I think Andrew is going to be going into more later. And then also I want to highlight, before I talk about our tax revenue, we will have pressure to conform on a couple of things that will cut our revenue. The child tax credit. There'll be a lot of political pressure to conform on tips and overtime, and there certainly will be pressure to take our standard deduction up from its current $17,500 for a married couple to much closer to the $30,000. We had tried to keep it in the range of $60,000, but that has been extremely difficult under the changes that have been made on the federal government, again, because we have to balance our budget. But the standard deduction is what benefits all taxpayers, not the rich. It's just the same amount no matter how much you make. So our lower tax revenue, just a couple of quick points before I finish up. 1/3 of Virginia's economy is federal spending. on civilian and military salaries, as well as on consultants. A lost federal job has twice the impact on our revenue because they tend to be higher management level jobs, and the average is twice as high as the average salary within Virginia. We'll also have tax loss from immigrants because of all of the deportations. Virginia's deportations exceed almost every other state. These working immigrants are paying taxes. They have a Social Security number, they're paying taxes, and those will go off the books. And then also I would highlight that the income tax is about 70% of our state budget. So all of these things put particular pressure on our existing sources of revenue of how do we deal with these lower tax revenue while dealing with all the extremes that are part of the needs that I've just spoken to. And the final bottom line is the federal funding prior to this bill has made up a third of the total state budget, and an additional 1.4 billion went directly to localities. All of those funds are in extreme jeopardy and or have already been cut in the reconciliation bill or are in the next year's bill for cutting. Oh, and if all else fails, I'll just do a executive order, and by fiat, I will impound the money. Having said that, with great calmness, I will just finish by saying it is extremely frustrating to me that the games that have been played to rush this bill through allows the bill to be described in totally inaccurate forms, and people do not have the basis of knowledge that they need. I know Democrats are conducting town halls. We've got to do as everything in columns, in talking to our neighbors, doing everything we can to bring these tax changes, inequities to light, as well as to bring truth to all of the cuts and the impact that is going to make on our tax bills here in the state, or true losses, as Senator Salim was complimented on, the real tragedy that is going to exist in many lives.
Okay, thank you so much. There's a comment here. I wish I could just download your brain. These slides are fantastic. Thank you so much. So I'm going to just keep going here. We're going to move into healthcare. Now, on the national level, the implementation of Medicaid reductions will be phased in, as we've talked about. But it's important to remember that their goal, what they're trying to do, what the Republicans want to do, is to reduce spending on Medicaid by $1 trillion. Now, you think about that, and they're going to say, oh, it's because we're getting people who don't deserve it off the system. You know, the single men playing video games, apparently, that are all out there, millions and millions of them. And we know that's not true. But one thing to say is, regardless of whether you think the people deserve Medicaid or not, that's $1 trillion out of our healthcare system. That's $1 trillion not going to our hospitals. And that's going to have ricochet impacts. It's going to impact the cost of your care, because if that $1 trillion doesn't cover the hospital's fixed cost, they have to raise the prices for other services to make up that revenue. So it's going to impact all of us, all of us. Now, there's two major provisions, because what they're trying to do is chisel away at it by making it harder to get coverage. And so they're doing it two main ways. One is the 6-month rather than 1-year eligibility verification. They're going to make you go through the paperwork twice as much. And then this work requirement. But what this means, the CBO estimates that they will ramp up $22 billion in 26, $55 billion, and the reductions in Medicaid revenue for hospitals will increase over the decade. Now, let's look at what this does to Virginia. Now, according to the Kaiser Foundation, Virginia represents 2.5% of total Medicaid spending. And so what I did is I calculated Virginia's share of this national government, the national savings. And this is a rough estimate, and other people may do differently and have better methodologies. But it indicates that Virginia in 26 could lose as much as $500 million in Medicaid revenue, and that ramps up to, at the end of the decade, close to $4 billion, a very massive increase. And the Kaiser Foundation and other people say that basically it's a 21% reduction in Medicaid spending, which is pretty brutal. So what that means in terms of lost health insurance, the U.S. Congress's Joint Economic Committee, the minority side, estimates that these provisions will cost 166,000 Virginians to lose their insurance. Now, we have to be a little bit careful when we talk about this because that doesn't start until after 2027. So what the Republicans will do is they'll say in 2026, oh, there were no Medicaid cuts. Don't worry about Medicaid cuts. That's never going to happen. Vote for Republicans. That's never going to happen. Well, yeah, because it's going to happen in 2027. They cleverly put the bad stuff till after the midterms. Now let's get into the details. Now I know this chart's a little busy, but I just want you to kind of understand how they're going about this. Now the top of this chart shows the population, and I got this from the Virginia's state government website, of the basically four main groups that get Medicaid. There's the aged, blind, and disabled, which is about 200,000. The low-income adults and children is about 76,000. The ACA, the Affordable Care Act of Obamacare expansions of 620,000. And then about 2,000 on their child health insurance program, the CHIP program. Now, they're attacking each of these groups differently. Each of them have different provisions that harm them. So for the aged, blind, and disabled, there is a moratorium on the Medicare Savings Program. Now, what this program did is it enabled people to use Medicaid to pay for Medicare premiums and Medicare co-payments. And that's really important for our aged population, and they're taking that away. They also put caps on payment rates to nursing homes to Medicare, which are lower than the current permissible rate. So they're lowering the revenue for nursing homes and those kind of places. And then they did do one thing which some of us might consider as a good thing, is they increased the home equity limits from 500,000 to $1 million. But then they turned around and put a moratorium on staffing for nursing homes. And those of us who have had to deal with an elder parent in those situations really understand the impact of inadequate staffing for our loved ones. So that, it may not save money, but it's going to damage the quality of care for many, many elderly. Then what they're doing for low-income adults and children, they reduce the retroactive coverage from 3 months to 2 months. So under current law, or law before this passed, if you had a medical condition, they could go back 3 months and pay for care back retroactively from 3 months from the date you applied for Medicaid. Now they reduce it for this group to 2 months. And then the big one is they establish work requirements for parents with children over 13 years of age. So if you have a 14-year-old child, they expect you to go, you have to work. The ACA expansion, which does include single people without children, they reduced the retroactive coverage to 1 month. They established a work requirement, and we can talk about what that does, but they also are requiring copays of up to 5% of a person's salary. So a person who's making $20,000 can be asked to pay $1,000 in copays. And, that's pretty brutal. And for CHIP, they established work requirements for parents with children over 13 years of age. But then there's a bunch of impacts down here at the bottom that apply to everyone. The Biden administration had tried to streamline the application process to make it easier to apply for it. They got rid of that. They now do, and this is a big one, eligibility determinations every 6 months. Twice the paperwork, twice the chance of somebody being kicked off because of mistake in paperwork. They reduced the level of federal payments for emergency care for immigrants, and they prohibit payments to any organization that provides family planning or abortion. So that you can see here, they're attacking at multiple levels the Medicaid program and multiple directions of attack. And all of these are damaging, but taken together, they're really damaging. So what's this impact on Virginia's budget? Well, first of all, there's many unfunded mandates in this. The state of Virginia next year will have to figure out how to develop a system to implement a system to check for duplicate enrollments that meets their standards, not just our standards, the federal government standards. It has to implement a system to ensure deceased individuals do not remain enrolled. Well, I think Virginia already has that, but now we're going to have to change it to meet their standards. Then you have to have a system to do eligibility determinations every 6 months. So that's a process, a system that Virginia is going to have to pay for. Then you have to implement a system to manage work requirements. When Georgia tried that, it was $100 million to implement the system. And then you have to implement a system to manage the copays. So these are a lot of systems that Virginia is going to have to rush to implement in the next year or two. And then there's the revenue reductions. And I'll just list them all. The big one is the FMAT incentive and the limits to provider tax, which Delegate Watts talked about. But other limits on state-directed payments and requirements for waiver. But there's just a lot of ways that they're chiseling out on Virginia's revenue from Medicaid, I'm sorry. So what's this mean for our hospitals? We've heard a lot of talk about rural hospitals, and it certainly will damage rural hospitals. But a 21% Medicaid reduction in Medicaid revenue means that Inova is going to lose $134 million in revenue. And that will impact Novova. They're a big, with lots of revenue, but $134 million will impact them. And it's important to remember that even though they're losing this revenue, Medicaid is payments for illnesses and treatments. Those illnesses aren't going away. People are still going to get sick. And the law is if you come to an emergency room, the hospital has to provide care. And so uncompensated care costs will remain the same and may even increase because people aren't getting preventative care. But what goes away is the revenue that pays for those costs. And what hospitals will be forced to do is shift those costs to other sources of revenue, which means their price of services for you, if you're working, are going to go up. So this doesn't just hurt the poor, it hurts everybody. So then let's go and look at the changes to the Affordable Care Act. And basically they're attacking it with a bunch of things that add up to a lot. They're doing provisions to make it harder to access health insurance. But for example, permitting the premium tax credit for only certain individuals. They're whittling away at that. And disallowing premium tax credits during periods of Medicaid ineligibility due to alien status. Requiring verification of eligibility more often, similar to what they're doing in Medicaid, and eliminating some other provisions. So the Minority House Budget Committee estimates those provisions will cause approximately 135,000 Virginians to lose health insurance. And so you add the 135 and the other 135, it's about close to 300,000 Virginians are going to lose health care insurance over the 10 years. And that, again, will ricochet throughout the system, and it's going to affect your health insurance costs. But let's remember they're also cutting discretionary. And I just put this chart over here, which I know you can't read, but it shows the cuts and this is copied from the budget request for HHS. This is their document over here. And it just shows all the draconian cuts to the discretionary programs, highlighting a few: $400 million for FDA, $16.9 billion cut for the National Institute of Health, and a $7 billion cut for the Administration for Children, Families, and Communities. So these discretionary cuts are going to impact our communities too. Let's talk about education. Now, the House version of this bill had really a lot of wild cuts to Pell Grant program, and thankfully the Senate took some of them out. But they still left in a lot of provisions that restrict Pell Grants, make it harder to access it. And it's hard to cost exactly what those are, but there will be fewer students getting Pell Grants. And then we need to note on the discretionary side, because the Pell Grant program has a mandatory component and a discretionary component, that the president is requesting a 30% funding cut for the Pell Grant program. And that it will impact George Mason University, where students will lose $14.7 million in lost aid for just George Mason University. Student loans. Their program and their plan is to reduce student loan subsidies by costs by $270 billion over 10 years. What does that mean? That means student loan borrowers are going to have to pay $270 billion more for their student loans. And they basically the way they do this is they increase borrowing costs by extending the income-based loan forgiveness program from 20 years to 30 years before you can get your forgiveness. And they also get rid of loan forbearances, make it much more difficult to get pauses in your loans due to extraneous emergency circumstances. Other provisions. Now, and Delegate Watts talked about that. There's a $1,700 contributions for organizations that grant scholarships for public or private schools. And something Virginia we need to think about is you can actually organize this to provide aid for public schools for things like tutoring, after school programs, and summer school programs. We have to think about that one a little bit, but it is primarily designed to provide federal funding for private schools. But we have to think about whether there's an opportunity there. They have an exclusion of employer payments for student loans for corporate taxes, which they increase taxes on college and universities endowments, and then that Trump account that Delegate Watts talked about. But they're also gutting the Department of Education. So this shows the various programs within Department of Education, the Office of Innovation and Improvement. A lot of this has to do with getting rid of federal statistics on education. But if we're going to improve education, we need those statistics. We need to understand what's going on, or we can't really figure out what programs work or not. And they're gutting those programs. Office of Special Education is flatlined, but hey, with inflation, that's a cut. Rehabilitation services, the Office of Career, Technical, and Adult Education, minus 33%. Secondary education, 59%. So you're seeing very massive cuts to the education programs that are very important to our children. I can't get away without their gutting science. I don't really understand this. I don't know what Republicans have against science, but they are gutting it. NIH is taking National Institute of Health is taking a 40% cut. That's 40% cut in funding for trying to find cures to diseases. I mean, it's mind-boggling to do that. The energy science programs to try to get renewable energy and understand how to do things like that is 14% cut. The National Science Foundation, a 54% cut. The science programs for NASA, a 46% cut. NOAA, 40% cut. And the National Institutes of Standards and Technology, a 34%. So they are systematically gutting science. Now, this has a huge impact because these programs fund a lot of the universities. So universities are taking a double whammy. They no longer getting the revenue from doing research that's funded by federal grants, and then they're losing student aid. And so that's really putting our universities in a very difficult position. Let's talk about the safety net. Changes to SNAP. There's a series of putting on work requirements, reducing monthly payments through reevaluation. They reduce benefits for people that have high utility expenses. They reduce benefits by prohibiting the use of internet costs and calculating the benefit eligibility. And then there's other things that are cut. So it's a pretty significant cuts to the SNAP program. But the big change is they were requiring that Virginia pay for a share of SNAP. Now, I'm not sure exactly what it is, but an estimate I saw, and I got this 9.86% from a briefing by the Secretary of Virginia, the department that does this. If we're in that range, we have to pay 10% of SNAP benefits. We get $1.8 billion in SNAP benefits a year, so we will lose. Delegate Watts and Senator Salim will have to come up with $180 million out of a very tight budget to do that. And then they also will have to pay an additional $80 million in administrative costs. The current breakout of administrative costs is 50-50, and now they're making the state pay up to 75%. So that means $250 million hole has just been blown in Virginia's budget for the SNAP program. There are other assistance programs that are getting gutted in the president's budget request. Nationally, there's a $4 billion program for low-income home energy assistance program. Virginia's share of that is about $100 million that we're going to lose. Virginia has, there's a $6.7 billion program for community development block grants. Now, this is kind of a guess because it varies from year to year and how the grant program works. But Virginia could lose around $50 million for that. So you see a pattern here. Our very good members of the General Assembly are going to be put in a very difficult position for the next General Assembly session. Let's talk a little bit about national security. Here's we get to see where the money's spent, because it's not just tax cuts that's raising the deficit, it's also defense and homeland security. The reconciliation bill provides $153 billion in defense spending that is available right now. Now, I'm a retired colonel in the Army Reserve. I served overseas and on multiple occasions in places like Afghanistan, and I've studied military stuff. And someone asked, what are you going to think about the Golden Dome? The Golden Dome is a program to provide protection against drones. The Atlantic Ocean is 1,500 miles across. There's no drones that can fly that far. And why we need drone defense in Kentucky, which they will pay for, we're going to spend billions and billions of dollars for a nutty program. But if you go through what the other things they're spending on, it's a lot of specific weapon systems programs. And the only thing I can say is the defense lobbyists had a field day with this bill, because they got a lot of things in there that I think a lot of military experts say we just don't need. And then on top of this $153 billion, the president's FY26 budget request increases defense spending by $113 billion. So that's $260 billion in increased defense spending in this bill. Let's talk about Homeland Security. The Reconciliation Act provides $45 billion for Homeland Security. A lot of it will go to private contractors, and they're changing the federal acquisition regulation to allow more sole sources so we can guess who's going to be getting those big contracts. But that's $45 billion. But then the 26th request also requests another $42 billion for Homeland Security. So they claim the border's secure now, right? That's the claim. What do they need that $80 billion for if the border's already secure? Then I want to get another part of security, and this is in a broader sense, is FEMA. And I was on the call with one of our district committees last night, and somebody asked about FEMA, and so I added this slide today. But the bottom line is states are going to have to find $37 billion to make up for cuts to FEMA. And let's be real, global warming, and I always call it global warming because it's getting warmer, is going to increase the cost of disasters. And while that's happening, the federal disaster assistance cuts are going to be about $2 billion, or a 45% reduction, and the disaster relief funds are being cut by $35 billion, or a 56%. And then I found this little nugget. They eliminate the flood hazard mapping risk analysis program. They're cutting out flood hazard mapping. And if the events of Texas this week show why that's maybe not a great idea. And there's also this idea that somehow the states can do everything, but there's economies of scale. There's no reason that our nation needs 50 different mapping systems for floods. It's more efficient, it's more cost effective to do one national system, but they're cutting it out. I also want to end on something that's really important in my mind. The cuts to aid, the Agency for International Development, which are illegal. It is an illegal impoundment. GAO is ruling that. This is against the law to do this, but they're doing it anyways. A professor at Boston University, their health department, is tracking how many people have died due to these AID cuts in just 4 months. 3 months, whatever it is. And they've tracked 130,000 deaths. 89,000 children have died due to this illegal impoundment. This is having real impact right now. And the Lancet, which is a respected medical journal, did a study estimating the impacts of the United States pulling out and no longer funding these programs. And they estimate 14 million people will die in the next 5 years. So this is brutal. This is ugly. And it's just, and they're lying about it. Secretary of State Rubio is lying, saying nobody's dying. The fact is people are dying and he's lying about it. So in conclusion, I'd like to summarize the impact on Virginia. Virginia's going to have to build at least 6 new IT systems. And we know that the Medicaid employment verification system costs Georgia around $100 million. So these are not cheap systems. We have lost Medicaid revenue. We have cuts to nutrition programs. We have education cuts, Pell Grants, increased student borrowing costs. We have the tax adjustments that Delegate Watts talked about to conform to the federal things. And frankly, I did the best I could with this, but I missed a whole bunch of stuff. There are many, many other impacts that are going to harm Virginia and harm our communities. So I'd like to end this with a statement that the Republican budget is about people. It's not, I've thrown lots of numbers over at you at the last hour and a half, but let's remember that behind every number is a human being. And those human beings have stories. And right now, too many of them are tragic stories. The child in this picture who is starving because Marco Rubio cut off the AID programs that kept that child alive. So we as Democrats need to learn those stories and we need to tell those stories because people need to understand in human terms. I can give these budget briefings. A picture of a child will have and a story of a child will have a bigger impact. So the road forward, and this is my plea to my Democratic colleagues and elected official, we must not be the party of defenders of a failed status quo. We know the tax system is a mess. It's the current federal tax system is a disaster. It is complicated and it allows the wealthy to escape paying taxes. We need to come up with a solution. The healthcare system in the United States is not, the Affordable Care Act made things better, but we all know there's many, many problems with the healthcare system. We need to have programs to fix it. Our educational system is, to me, the funding for higher education is dumb. We have 3 ways to fund higher education. If you're wealthy enough, you can do 529s and save, and that's okay. But then we go to an 18-year-old and we say, to fund your future, you got to take on a huge amount of debt. Does that make sense? And then for the poorest, we have this incredibly complicated forms where they don't really know what they're going to get and they can't plan for college until they go through this crazy federal aid form. So the education funding system, we got to recognize is not really that great, and we need to come up with things to do better. And the safety net is dysfunctional, right? People have to apply to energy assistance programs, to SNAP programs, to TANF programs, to housing programs. We can do better. and the Democratic Party needs to come up with ideas to do better. So we need to, as a party, offer bold but practical solutions that people can believe in. That's my plea to the Democratic Party. And I think if you look, and I've been looking at some of the bills, a lot of members of Congress and a lot of our senators have some really good bills. Cory Booker's doing some great work on education, and there's others. And we need to find those bills and talk about them and understand that we are the party of solutions, not just giving tax cuts to the rich. So that we've gone on an hour and 32 minutes. I will stick around to take questions. If you want, put them in the chat. It's probably the easiest way. Though, and if you have to go, we completely understand. And maybe we should stop recording at this point. But what's the first question? We will try to figure out a way to get the slides to people. Are there any other questions? Michael Passante, maybe you can unmute yourself. Or put your chart.
Answered several of the questions in the chat. So those don't need to be picked up on. You'll see answers below.
Oh, okay, great.
My question, and sorry, I was muted before. How difficult would it be for Democrats to reverse these cuts if they took control of the House in a year or two?
That's a political question, very difficult one, because you'd have to get the president. It's always easier to get a law passed than unpass it. And plus, you can only do it through reconciliation. And just as the Republicans did it, because otherwise the Republicans will filibuster it in the Senate. And so that means we would have to win the House and the Senate. But the problem is the president will never sign it. So it's going to be really hard to get these undone. I don't think Trump will ever sign a law undoing this. So we're really looking at 2029 when we absolutely need to have a Democratic president. Because
I want to answer also and say that the way in which I look at the deficit, that really came home to me. It has been since the end of World War II when the deficit equaled the gross GDP. We are really far exceeding a deficit that we've ever had. And you're going to have other countries who are going to compete with the borrowing that we've depended upon internationally to carry that deficit. So that's half my answer. So the other half of my answer, those cuts have to be made up then to some responsible degree with additional revenue. And as Andy just referred to, the filibuster, when you couldn't even get the highest bracket back up to 39.7% from 37%, a modest increase to put it back to what it was before 2017 for some additional revenue. I'm just can't be optimistic about how easy it's going to be to get out from this without a lot of soul searching.
yeah, we got work to do to win the elections that are really the only way to get this is the Democrats need to control all three, the president, the House, and the Senate. That's going to be very, that's our challenge. Jerry, you have a question. Or put it in the chat if you can.
Muted. Oh, not muted now. Thank you. Andy and Vivian, this was terrific. Thank you so much for your hard work. I think most of us on the call are wonks who really want to delve deeper, but we're also confronting November's election in the Commonwealth. And I think we have to have a unified statement from the Democratic Party that is iterated over and over and over again, why we cannot elect MAGA Republicans to statewide office or to the House of Delegates. And I just would appeal to you or to others with greater communication skill sets. The distillation to the 5 iterated factoids about how we are destroyed by this bill and why we should never elect Republicans again is what we need to carry forth into the election cycle. So, I just would urge you to share what you've offered, and thanks to those who were recording. But I also think we are collectively called, 170 plus people on this call, could be mobilized to be the bow wave of communicating the horrors that are descending upon America and why we should fight like hell and never let them take another office in the Commonwealth or in the country.
I can assure you, Jerry, that for the last week, people have been working very hard to get those talking points that you are looking for. Again, this is basically less than a week since the bill was signed. It was rushed through, so having accurate information that won't be undercut and lose credibility is very important in coming together with those top line points that you're looking for. For myself, I always provide, let's say I have the 3 good examples rule that I try to live by, so that people have some example that they can relate to that means something to them, whether the student loan aspect means something to them or the tax credit for energy improvements. And so that's why the level of detail I was giving will be available, but the talking points that you're talking about absolutely are critical. And I can assure you that there's a lot of hard work going on, even as I speak, to come up with the appropriate points that will do the job and help people focus.
Yeah, this briefing wasn't designed to be political talking points. I was trying to get the information out, and it's my hope that people who have talents better than mine in that area, and I'm sure, as Delegate Watts said, those people are working on this. And this is just, but I thought the purpose of this briefing is to give you an in-depth understanding of what's going on, and I hope we've achieved at least part of that tonight. Saddam, do you have some?
No, I was going to say that is what the intention of this briefing was, is to provide you with the information as we head into November and the election next year, including our special to get Supervisor Walkinshaw elected to Congress. It is going to be our responsibility. It is going on the field to talk about these issues where the average voters, they're not paying any attention to some of these issues that we care about until years later they look back and ask what happened. And we're saying, hey, we know exactly what happened, but they're just not aware at times. So I hope you will all take this information. And I could talk about housing. I can talk about gun violence prevention. We have to add on the topic of the budget and how it impacts everyday lives as the next conversation when we're talking to people.
Okay, I did figure out how to put the briefing slides in the chat room, so you can go there and download them, and then we may figure out some other way to get them out. It's been thank you, Delegate Watts, for doing this. It was great having you, Senator Salim. It was really, as always, great to have you. I think we're going to wrap it up at this point. It's been a long day for some of us. And I want to thank you for, again, your attendance, and spread the word. Talk to your neighbors about this. Talk to, when you're on the doors, hopefully you can take some nuggets out of this, and then we can get the word out, because knowledge is power, and we need power right now. We need knowledge. So, do you have any final comments, Delegate Watts or Senator Salim?
I guess I still just have to underscore, just as important on the state level, that we have the governor, lieutenant governor to cast the tie vote in the Senate, the attorney general to join in those important lawsuits on behalf of the states on some of these draconian cuts. as well as have a working majority in the House rather than just a one vote and hope nobody's sick operation that we've had to be so incredibly disciplined about. Please, please, please don't let November get lost with all of the other things that are competing.
If the Republicans are implementing Medicaid cuts, it's going to be very, very different than if Abigail Spanberger is doing it.
That's the cleverness. We've got to make sure that we communicate. This is what's been passed. This is what's coming, because it won't be felt until after the midterms. The November next.
Okay, well, thank you, everyone. Have a good night.